The fall of the Jedi is often framed as a sudden betrayal, a clever Sith plot, or a tragic miscalculation, but that explanation is far too clean for what actually happened. The Jedi did not collapse because they suddenly chose evil, nor because they failed to recognize it. They collapsed because they spent years convincing themselves that evil could be managed, regulated, and morally contained. What destroyed them was not corruption embraced, but corruption administered. The Jedi did not see themselves as crossing lines. They saw themselves as standing in the middle, absorbing darkness so the galaxy would not have to, and that belief hollowed them out from the inside. The Jedi normalized violence while branding themselves as peacekeepers, and that contradiction became the foundation of their moral decay. They never claimed to be pacifist, but they did claim moral authority. Violence was framed as a tool of last resort, yet over time it became routine. Jedi assassinated targets, led armies, conducted raids, and executed enemies while insisting these acts served peace rather than power. Once violence is no longer exceptional, it stops being a burden and starts becoming infrastructure. The Jedi ceased to be guardians who intervened reluctantly and became enforcers who planned campaigns. That shift mattered because peacekeeping rooted in regularized violence is not peacekeeping at all. It is controlled warfare with better language. Nothing exposes this more starkly than the clone army, a moral catastrophe the Jedi chose to legitimize. The clones were engineered beings, denied autonomy, bred for obedience, and discarded when no longer useful. The Jedi did not design this system, but they accepted it, led it, and sanctified it. Authorship matters less than endorsement. By taking command of the clone army, the Jedi transformed an atrocity into policy. They taught soldiers bred as property that their purpose was noble, while ignoring the fundamental injustice of their existence. This was not a tragic necessity forced upon the Order. It was a choice made in the name of stability, and once the Jedi placed themselves at the head of a slave army, their moral high ground was already gone. The Jedi also accepted deception as a stabilizing tool, convincing themselves that truth was dangerous in the wrong hands. Information about the Sith, political manipulation, and the true nature of the war was deliberately obscured from the public. The rationale was always the same. People would panic, order would collapse, stability would be lost. But secrecy does not preserve freedom. It concentrates power. Once truth becomes optional in the name of peace, accountability disappears. The Jedi believed they were protecting the galaxy by withholding knowledge, but in reality they were training themselves to govern without consent. Moral authority cannot survive in the dark. Political compromise bound the Jedi to corruption long before the Sith ever revealed themselves. The Order knew the Republic was decaying. Corporate militarization, bribery, exploitation, and legislative paralysis were obvious and long-standing. Yet instead of confronting that corruption directly, the Jedi chose preservation over disruption. Collapse seemed worse than complicity. This is the core of their necessary evil logic. Maintain a flawed system because change is risky. But by protecting corruption, they guaranteed that change would come violently rather than reformatively. The Jedi did not fail to see the rot. They chose to sit atop it. Emergency powers then became permanent an identity. Every extraordinary measure was framed as temporary. The war was temporary. Militarization was temporary. Expanded authority was temporary. But time passed and nothing was relinquished. What begins as exception becomes habit with frightening ease. The Jedi stopped treating moral compromise as an emergency response and began treating it as normal operating procedure. Once emergency behavior becomes standard, morality stops being situational and starts being performative. The Jedi still spoke the language of restraint, but their actions were shaped by routine militarism. At that point, the fall was not dramatic. It was administrative. Central to this collapse was the belief that discipline made evil safe to wield. The Jedi genuinely believed that because they were trained in emotional control and spiritual restraint, they could safely use dark tools without being corrupted by them. This belief was fatal. Moral danger is not neutralized by calmness. Violence does not become ethical because the person wielding it meditates afterward. Power does not become safe because the wielder believes themselves pure. The Jedi mistook self-restraint for immunity. In doing so, they blinded themselves to how deeply they were already changing. Over time, the Jedi treated order as more important than justice. Justice is disruptive. It demands confrontation, accountability, and sometimes upheaval. Order is stable. It preserves structures. Faced with that choice, the Jedi increasingly chose stability. Exploitation was tolerated. Inequality was ignored. Suffering was managed rather than resolved. As long as chaos was contained, injustice could be postponed. This transformed the Jedi from agents of moral change into custodians of a broken system. They were no longer asking how to make the galaxy better, only how to keep it from falling apart. That is not peacekeeping. That is maintenance. This led to a philosophy of lesser evil rather than moral clarity. Decisions were no longer justified by asking whether they were right, but whether they were better than the alternative. That shift seems reasonable in crisis, but it is corrosive over time. Once morality becomes comparative instead of principled, anything can be justified as long as something worse exists. The Jedi did not become Sith, but they abandoned the moral absolutes that once defined them. They stopped standing for something and started managing outcomes. In that space, identity dissolves quietly. Their greatest necessary evil was believing they were immune to corruption. Corruption, in their view, was something that happened to others, to Sith, to politicians, to soldiers, not to Jedi. This belief was not arrogance in the loud sense, but in the quiet, institutional sense that is far more dangerous. They believed their intentions insulated them from consequence, but morality is not a title you hold. It is a practice you repeat. The moment the Jedi stopped resisting corruption and started regulating it, they lost the very discipline they trusted to protect them. This is why the Jedi did not fall, because they embraced evil. They fell because they tried to control it. They believed they could organize violence, administer war, regulate power, and preserve a corrupt system without becoming part of it. They believed darkness could be contained through oversight, committees, and calm minds. But once you manage evil instead of opposing it, you become its architect. The Jedi did not lose because they were villains. They lost because they became managers of darkness, convinced that as long as they held the reins, the horse would never trample them. In the end, the tragedy of the Jedi is not that they failed to stop evil. It is that they believed evil could be safely domesticated. They did not see themselves drifting. They believed they were holding the line, and by the time they realized that the line had moved, they were standing so far from their origin that returning was no longer possible. Necessary evil did not destroy the Jedi in a single moment. It destroyed them by degrees, compromise by compromise, until nothing was left but an institution that still spoke of light while operating entirely in shadow. What follows from this realization is not merely a condemnation of the Jedi, but an indictment of a mindset that confuses stewardship with righteousness. Once the Jedi accepted the role of managing necessary evils, they began to see themselves as indispensable intermediaries between chaos and order. That self-image was intoxicating because it justified every compromise as responsibility rather than failure. If they withdrew, the galaxy would burn. If they intervened imperfectly, at least they were there. This logic is seductive precisely because it feels altruistic, but it also ensures that withdrawal from immoral systems becomes unthinkable. The Jedi did not ask how to end injustice. They asked how to keep it from getting worse, and that framing trapped them permanently inside the machinery of harm. This is why their downfall was so complete when it came. Institutions built on moral management rather than moral clarity cannot survive exposure, because their authority depends on the belief that someone competent is in control. When the Clone Wars revealed how compromised the Jedi had become, they lost the one thing that justified their extraordinary power: trust. Not fear, not respect, but trust. The galaxy did not see guardians making tragic choices. It saw generals leading slave armies, spies withholding truth, and mystics sanctioning endless war. When Palpatine finally moved against them, the Jedi did not fall as martyrs. They fell as functionaries who had outlived their moral explanation. The tragedy is compounded by how little resistance the Jedi offered at the philosophical level once the trap was set. They debated tactics endlessly but rarely questioned premises. They asked how to fight the war, not whether commanding it was corrupting them beyond recognition. They asked how to balance the Force, not whether the structures they defended were strangling it. Necessary evil became an assumption rather than a problem to be solved, and assumptions once embedded are far more dangerous than overt malice, because they do not feel like choices anymore. They feel like gravity. This mindset also explains why dissent within the Order faded so quickly. Questioning necessary evil is uncomfortable because it threatens identity. If violence, deception, and compromise are no longer necessary, then years of sacrifice were not tragic but wrong. Few institutions can face that possibility honestly. So dissenters were marginalized, reframed as naive, or quietly sidelined. The Order did not silence critics loudly. It outgrew them, and once internal critique disappears, decline accelerates in silence. It is also important to recognize that the Jedi's fall was not inevitable because they allowed evil, but because they allowed it without an exit strategy. Necessary evil is only coherent if it is temporary, constrained and actively dismantled once the crisis passes. The Jedi never dismantled anything. The clone army remained. Emergency powers expanded. Secrecy deepened. Compromise accumulated. There was no path back to moral ground because no one was tasked with building one. Managing darkness replaced the idea of overcoming it. This is where the contrast with Sith philosophy becomes ironic. The Sith are honest about power. They do not pretend domination is benevolent. The Jedi, by contrast, believed their intentions purified their actions. That belief made them less self-aware than their enemies. The Sith embraced corruption openly. The Jedi denied it while practicing it in controlled doses. History shows that denial is often more corrosive than excess, because it erodes the capacity to recognize when you have already crossed the line. The ultimate proof that necessary evil destroyed the Jedi is not Order 66 itself, but how unprepared they were for it conceptually. They had planned for external threats, not internal reckoning. They did not believe the system they upheld could turn on them legitimately. They expected betrayal from villains, not from the moral logic they had been using for years. When Palpatine framed their destruction as a necessary evil to preserve order, he did not invent that argument, he mirrored it. And because the Jedi had normalized that reasoning, they had no moral language left to counter it convincingly. This is the quietest and most devastating irony of their fall. The Jedi trained the galaxy to accept extraordinary violence in the name of stability, and then were shocked when that logic was used against them. They had spent years teaching that order justified brutality, secrecy justified manipulation, and emergency justified suspension of norms. When the emergency became permanent, they discovered that they were no longer the ones defining necessity. In the end, the Jedi did not lose because they failed to defeat the Sith in combat. They lost because they surrendered the moral high ground long before the final blow was struck. They became indispensable to a broken system, and indispensability is the most dangerous position any moral institution can occupy. Once the galaxy believed it could not function without the Jedi managing darkness, it also became plausible that someone else could manage it better. This is why the Jedi story is not a warning about evil overpowering good, but about good compromising itself into irrelevance. Necessary evil did not arrive suddenly. It arrived as responsibility, as pragmatism, as burden accepted for the greater good. And by the time the Jedi realized that they were no longer resisting darkness but organizing it, the distinction between guardian and administrator had already vanished.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.